What if the greatest Nazi defeat wasn't Stalingrad, but something you were never told about? It happened in the summer of 1944. On June 22nd, German soldiers in Belarus woke expecting just another day at the front. What came was a storm. More than 2 million Soviets, backed by 5,000 tanks and 7,000 aircraft, crashed down like a wave that couldn't be stopped. In just 58 days, Army Group Center, the heart of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, was pulverized. Over 60% of its troops vanished in a nightmare the Germans would remember as Operation Bagration. Those men had stepped into a real hell.
They trapped over 100,000 Nazis there in a ring of fire.
June 1944. The Third Reich was beginning to crack. In Normandy, the Allies had just landed and all Europe held its breath. In Berlin, the High Command believed the war's fate would be decided in France. But another threat was brewing in the east, silent and lethal. The Eastern Front was a 2,000-kilometer monster bleeding from every vein. The Wehrmacht was no longer the unstoppable machine of earlier years. Manpower was short, ammunition scarce, and every lost tank was irreplaceable. In German headquarters, the situation map had become a minefield of bad news. Yet one sector still seemed safe: Belarus. There stood Army Group Center, a veteran force that had held since 1941. The terrain was difficult, the defensive lines deep, and Nazi intelligence saw no sign of an imminent attack. The enemy seemed busy farther south in Ukraine or preparing new blows toward the Baltic. No one expected an assault in the center. No one. The calm was an illusion.
The toll in lives and property had been unimaginable. But what was most precious was still alive. It had been 3 years of horror. But now, in 1944, the Red Army had come back, over the long and winding road the Germans had trod towards Moscow.
Beyond the lines, the Red Army prepared in silence. Roads filled with tanks hidden among the trees. Trains unloaded troops day and night. Squadrons gathered overhead that had yet to fire a shot. The storm was about to break, and when it did, there would be no refuge.
Through the winter, the Red Army slugged westward along hundreds of miles of front. Morale was high. This was a battle-hardened army with victories behind it in the Ukraine, Moldavia, the Crimea. They were a broad tide of liberation. As winter turned to the mud of spring, they waited. With summer would come the campaigning season and the offensive that would hurl the Germans out of Belorussia for good.
At dawn, the Belarusian forests looked still. Only the drone of insects broke the silence. For the soldiers of Army Group Center, it felt like another day on a front that seemed to have stabilized. No major Soviet offensives for months. Yet enemy patrols crept through wet trees while Nazi officers studied maps about to become useless. In Berlin, Hitler and his generals were convinced the next Soviet blow would come from the south, through Ukraine. Reserves were concentrated there. Lines were reinforced. Fuel, guns, and ammunition flowed to the south. Abwehr reports confirmed it. Soviet trains were moving in daylight toward that region. Troops, artillery, armor, or so it seemed. No one noticed those cars were empty. While the High Command braced for a ghost in Ukraine, the real nightmare advanced under cover of night. Millions of men, tanks, and trucks moved toward Belarus without a single light. The Soviets dismounted their guns in silence, laid new rail lines in darkness, and hid formations under thick forest canopy. Every step was choreographed to avoid suspicion. German reconnaissance planes flew over shadows. Trains ran empty by day, full of death by night.
The Soviet High Command began to issue its plans for the annihilation of Hitler's Army Group Center. 4 great Soviet army groups would strike simultaneously, liberating Belarusia, then breaking through to the Baltic, East Prussia, and eventually Warsaw.
Then the day came. On June 22nd, Operation Bagration erupted and the sky split open. Thousands of Soviet guns fired in unison from positions that didn't exist on German maps. Communications collapsed within minutes. Officers shouted into radios that no longer answered. Divisions had no idea where their flanks were or who, if anyone, stood beside them. For many German soldiers, the enemy wasn't even visible. They heard tanks growling through the trees, guns thundering, and the crunch of comrades dropping one by one. They didn't know where the attack came from or how many there were. The only certainty was that they were alone. The 3rd Panzer Army, supposedly the armored backbone of the sector, was a mirage. On paper, it had hundreds of tanks. In reality, most were out of action for lack of parts, fuel, or through plain abandonment. Many battalions were skeletal, regiments of 2,000 men mustering barely 800. The Luftwaffe, once master of the skies, couldn't get airborne. Starved of fuel, air superiority vanished. German pilots watched hell from the ground. Orders from Berlin were clear. Hold at all costs, not a step back. Commanders at the front knew they couldn't. Escape routes were cut. The Soviets didn't just smash the front. They infiltrated the flanks and bagged whole divisions. It became a hunt, trapped among rivers, marshes, and forests. Many soldiers wandered aimlessly. Some tried to regroup, others simply ran. Local reports were desperate. We have no contact with the divisions. The front line no longer exists. Soviet artillery seems to be everywhere. Sometimes they didn't even know which way the enemy was. They only knew everything they relied on was coming apart, until nothing was left.
Now they were powerless to inflict further damage.
One of the greatest errors was overconfidence. Blinded by the idea of a southern blow, Hitler refused any withdrawals. Even as the news grew dire, he ordered positions held. What he didn't grasp, or didn't want to, was that there were no positions to hold. What had been a front had become a net of ambushes and closed roads, with divisions chopped to pieces and supply lines severed. For the men trapped there, logic died. Forests that once offered cover now hid the enemy. Maps that once brought security became useless. Command that once gave answers now transmitted empty orders. Resist. But how, when even the Führer's decisions were wrong? The strategist who once terrified Europe had been deceived and now faced multiple fronts in crisis.
One of the reasons for the German defeat in Operation Bagration was that, once more, Hitler transferred troops to the west, this time to meet the anticipated cross-channel invasion of the Western Allies. On the night of 5th to 6th of June 1944, more than 4,000 landing ships and over 1,000 warships ferried Allied troops onto the Normandy coast, which was relatively lightly defended because Allied deception measures had convinced the Germans that the landings were going to come elsewhere. The German Army, the German Navy, the German Air Force were too weak to offer much resistance. So the war was now being fought on two fronts.
Army Group Center didn't collapse in a single blow. It came apart like a dam that groans, bursts, and drags everything under. Sectors once deemed impenetrable fell in hours. What should have been a defensive belt became a field of ruins. Cut up and disoriented, German divisions were easy prey. This wasn't a retreat, it was an implosion. The Soviet offensive didn't advance, it devoured. And as German units tried to slow the avalanche, an invisible war exploded behind them. More than 100,000 Belarusian partisans launched a coordinated sabotage campaign. Bridges blown, trains derailed, ammo dumps in flames. Rail lines were dynamited in dozens of places, paralyzing Nazi logistics. Trucks bogged in mud. Tanks ran dry. Soldiers went without food or bullets. Army Group Center began to rot from within. Then came the fall of the cities. Vitebsk fell first. In under 72 hours, 5 German divisions were surrounded and annihilated. What should have been a fortified strongpoint became a mass grave. Next, Mogilev, besieged on 3 sides, fell with no hope of relief. The defenders fought until their ammo ran out. Then, silence. Orsha was crushed by a flood of Soviet armor and a bombardment that turned defenses to dust. There was no orderly withdrawal, not even time to run. Berlin kept ordering resistance to the last man, but by the time orders arrived, there were no men left to obey. Bobruisk became a death trap. The Soviets closed a perfect encirclement. More than 40,000 Germans were crushed in a pincer of steel and fire. No one escaped. Absolutely no one. Finally came the symbolic blow, the place where the Nazis tried to leave their mark of destruction even as they retreated.
In 1944, the retreating Germans were determined to wipe Minsk and everything else in Belorussia off the face of the earth. They blew up factories, ravaged farms, slaughtered livestock, put villages to the torch, destroyed communications. They even invented special machines to do it with German efficiency.
German will meant nothing against Soviet power. The capital of Belarus fell on July 3rd. The heart of Army Group Center was pierced, crushed, and buried under a storm of artillery and armor. It proved the front, as the Third Reich knew it, no longer existed. The numbers strain belief. 17 German divisions were completely destroyed and ceased to exist as combat units. 28 more were so weakened they lost over half their strength. In total, more than 300,000 Germans were killed, wounded, or captured. Not even Stalingrad inflicted such deep and rapid damage. Bagration was more than an offensive. It was a military extermination. In the chaos, the scenes repeated like an infernal loop. Roads choked with corpses and burning vehicles, officers without troops, troops without direction, whole groups fleeing on foot through forests that no longer sheltered them. Radios carried only calls for help. No one answered. The panic came not from the enemy seen, but from the enemy unseen. Many were captured without firing a shot. Others, abandoned by their superiors, surrendered at the first burst. Collapse came so fast, Berlin needed days to grasp its scale. Hitler refused to accept reality. He ordered impossible counterattacks. He spoke of reorganizing the front, but there was no front to reorganize. Only remnants, shattered columns, abandoned ground. And while everything sank, the Soviets did not stop.
Soon the Red Army had advanced another 200 miles west and was outside the gates of Warsaw. Here, Stalin called upon the city's inhabitants to rise up against the Nazis. But when they did so, on the 1st of August 1944, led by Polish nationalists, Stalin held back until the German SS and police wiped them out, razing most of the city to the ground. 2 months of desperate street fighting, 26,000 German troops were killed, and 200,000 Polish men, women, and children.
The Soviets pressed on against a weakened foe. The road to Berlin grew ever clearer, but that is another story. Even so, Moscow still echoed with Bagration, a victory that delivered the war's crucial message. The myth of German invincibility had died. With it, the heart of the Reich began to beat slower. Honor was gone. Only dust, hunger, and silence remained. Those who survived the storm weren't soldiers, they were specters. Among the hundreds of thousands who made up Army Group Center's losses, many prisoners didn't understand how they had ended there. Some still carried obsolete maps, senseless orders, the names of officers already dead. They stared at one another, searching for answers in empty eyes. For the Soviets, those prisoners were more than beaten enemies. They were a symbol. Living proof that the Wehrmacht, the machine that had ravaged half of Europe, could be broken, and everyone needed to see it. On July 17, 1944, Moscow woke different. There was no festival, but there was expectation. They weren't celebrating victory, but something more cruel, a long-awaited humiliation, the March of the Captives. More than 57,000 gaunt German soldiers were forced to parade through the streets of the Soviet capital. Double file, in silence. Like defeated cattle before a crowd that did not forget.
All pride burned out of them. They shuffled in embarrassment down the broad boulevards of the Soviet capital. It was one of the strangest events of the unknown war. No sound came from onlookers or marchers, save for the muffled tread of worn boots. The crowd uttered neither cheers nor curses. They stared at these impotent enemies who would not meet their eyes.
For hours they walked under the gaze of thousands of Muscovites, spat on, insulted, or simply stared at with cold contempt. For many prisoners, that was the moment they understood the Reich had lost far more than a front. It had lost the myth. And soon it would lose the war. Stalingrad had been a bloody defeat, but it could still be explained. Tactical errors, bad weather, Hitler's hubris. This was different. Bagration wasn't a setback. It was a collapse. A free fall, and now its consequence marched before the world. The German army, beaten and humiliated, was reduced to a long line of empty faces headed for prison camps in Siberia. Officers who once barked orders now walked with eyes fixed on the ground. Veterans of France, Poland, and Russia no longer spoke. They only swallowed hard. Operation Bagration didn't just annihilate Army Group Center. It annihilated the confidence of thousands and the Reich's story about being unstoppable. In the end, it shattered the very idea that Germany could win the war. After Moscow, soldiers no longer marched by conviction, but by inertia, because they knew nothing else. There was no turning back. In only 58 days, the Soviet Union advanced more than 700 kilometers, crossing marshes, fortifications, and entire armies. 500,000 German casualties marked the price of deception, arrogance, and error. What began as a forgotten sector on the map became the beginning of the end. After Bagration, Romania and Bulgaria abandoned the Reich. Berlin ceased to be an empire. It became a besieged fortress, trembling to its foundations. For the Germans who survived, nothing was the same. They had believed in invincibility. They had marched in spotless uniforms with promises of glory. But in Belarus, under a sky of fire, they learned a brutal truth. Even the most feared colossus can be dragged down, disarmed, and humiliated. Sometimes defeat doesn't arrive with a bullet, but with the silence of a city washing away your footsteps. And that's how we reach the end. If you like this video, join us next time as we continue exploring military history.